Good evening, everybody. What a nice crowd. This is awesome. Thank you for coming out. This is great. Welcome to this one we're very proud to present. I'm Angie Coiro. I'm the interviewer for what we call our This Is Now Society and Politics. And I'm also, you can check that out at kalw.org where I interview authors. My mom used to say that. KALW, San Francisco. It's called Book It, and you can find it there. So tonight I am very pleased to bring on James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber for their new book, Microdosing. The use of tiny, regular amounts of psychedelics for physical and mental improvement has been going on for decades, but the US government just can't seem to make peace with the idea of authorized research. The US government does have still a page up on NIH.com. It did, or NIH.gov. It did this afternoon. By the time you get home, I don't know if the page will still be there. So James Fadiman needs no introduction, obviously, but let's do it anyway. He is known variously as the godfather or father of microdosing. His first psychedelic experience was 1961. It evolved into a career and a cause. He's kind of, sort of retired, but he keeps doing things. His 36 books that he has to his name. He also worked as a literary agent, a lecturer, a management consultant, and president of a wood pellet company. That's for another night. There are two of his books that are particularly on topic. In fact, they share the same co-author, Symphony of Cells, Who You Are and Why You Don't Know It, and The Psychedelic Explorer, Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys. Jordan Gruber describes himself as, this is right off his website, a Renaissance wordsmith, midwifing remarkable books for remarkable people. He knows his way around words. He's a writer, a ghostwriter, and an editor. He co-authored Symphony of Cells with James, and he authored The Bounce, which is a guidebook to rebound exercise. He founded enlightenment.com, and he's an advocate for the Superbound Rebound Exercise Program. James and Jordan, come on up. Say hi, guys.
Don't fall down the stairs. Don't fall down the stairs. Okay.
Let you guys get settled in.
Oh, my.
All right.
Wow.
Nice crowd, huh?
Well, I haven't been here up here for about 12 years. Some of you are older, but some of you are immortal, which is really a great pleasure to see you again.
So I want to set some groundwork, then we'll talk about what microdosing is and is not. But first off, I just want to call attention to a sentence in the book, which is, what's in this book may be fully or partially incorrect. That is probably true of most nonfiction, but you guys actually said it. Why is that?
Well, we thought we would limit ourselves to the truth in this book, which made it a much shorter book. And the fact is that microdosing is an expanding and developing field even as we sit here. And so some of the things that we thought were true a year or two ago, we've changed as we finish publication. That's how observational science works. You get new information, new ideas, new experiences, new people entering the field from a different place. So it's just simply honest to say that and we say it like a dozen times, anything that you learn from this book, check it out against your own experience, not against the book.
And also, most of the research that's been done on microdosing has been done in the last 2 or 3 years. So things are evolving rapidly, and we keep being surprised at how many conditions seem to be benefited by it. So things are changing, and we also wanted to just do a little CYA.
Got it. The book makes it very clear also what you're not going to do, which is tell people where to go out and buy stuff. You're not going to do that.
Nope.
But let's go to the very, very basics. What is microdosing, and which of you wants to take that?
Sure, I'll start. Microdosing is taking 1/10 to 1/20th of the dose that you would take for a standard recreational psychedelic trip with the classic psychedelics. So mainly we're talking psilocybin-containing mushrooms and LSD, and there are other substances that we also talk about, but it's just simpler if we talk about LSD and psilocybin. And so when you take this kind of a very small dose, you don't have any psychedelic visions or iterations, as Jim likes to say. No anacondas will be eating you. You'll be barely aware that you're on something for most people. It's kind of like you're on some coffee, and that's about it. And when you're taking this low of a dose, what often happens is that after the day is done, people have forgotten they've even been taking a dose, and as Isla Waldman coined it, you have a really good day.
So, Jim, that's a distinction then between microdosing on a regular basis and living every day with a buzz. These are two very different things.
I hope so. Yeah, living every day with a buzz, which some of you probably know about, that's what we call overdose. In fact, the way you measure the correct dose of a microdose is, does it affect you positively in the ways that you intended? And should you say, and I'm kind of taking off a little bit, and the lights in the bookstore are particularly, oh my goodness, that's too much. Okay, so if you're enjoying it a little too much and forgetting kind of why you were taking it, that's what we call overdosing, and you come back down the next time you do it. So it's kind of self-correcting.
And what you find out is that if you take too much, less is enough, especially on, we have two main categories of benefits: physical and mental health conditions, as well as enhanced performance and everything from art and writing to sports and martial arts and all that. If you take too much of a microdose, very quickly you start losing focus. And maybe you can do it one day, but you can't do it 2 or 3 days later when you dose again. It's just too much. So everybody's subject to the mores. If it's good, more must be better. And we're saying, no, less is often enough and often better.
You also say start low and go slow.
Right. Our little mantra is start low, meaning start below where you think it'll even affect you. And if that works for you, then you can go slightly until you get the effects you want. We start, for example, we recommend with psilocybin 1/10 of a gram. But we have lots and lots of people who say, I just go over the moon with that. I find 1/100th of a gram works fine for me. So there are people who are extremely sensitive, and they operate at a whole different level. And the first people who I found doing this knew some of each other, and they called themselves the micro people. And you get the feeling of, little teeny people. But that's what we're looking at, is one of the problems with pharmaceuticals is they come in these little dose packets and you can't do much with it. The nice thing about microdosing is you work yourself in and out of what's correct for you, and you take days off. Fundamental to microdosing is days off, and fundamental to a sequence of microdoses called microdosing is you take weeks off. So we're not just to keep it clear, we're not in the pharmaceutical realm at all. We're much more in the vitamin realm.
Jordan, what's the downside of doing it every day?
Well, it doesn't work as well. You might have some tolerance building up, and you don't have the time to sort of absorb it. And we use the word integration a lot. By taking it over time, even though some of the benefits build up, and we could talk about the science a little later, you have the expansive amount of time to really absorb and understand and make use of it. So when Jim started early on, he found out, he came up with a protocol called the Fadiman protocol. That is, on day 1 you're on, day 2 you're off, day 3 you're off, and day 4 you're on.
But day 2, you're still on. And that was the first discovery, that even though the psilocybin has left your system is still making use of what it has acquired. Now, remember, most of the things we take, which are called pharmaceuticals, you take daily or a couple of times a day. Why? Because they're symptom suppressing. They're holding down a symptom. And as soon as they leave the body, the symptom says, well, I'm glad you're gone. Whew. Microdosing is the exact opposite. It's giving the body more of an opportunity to do what bodies do fantastically, which is heal themselves.
There are a couple substances you mentioned that aren't good for this. You mentioned psilocybin and LSD, which are two of the ones you mentioned in the book were interesting. Ketamine, because this morning Wired came up with a new article. The ketamine, yeah, it did die. My microphone's dead. It's back. I think we have a short, perhaps. Do you have another handheld? That's a good idea.
Okay.
So I'll stay with it while I can. It's working. Today in Wired, the ketamine-fueled, stand by, the ketamine-fueled psychedelic slumber parties that get tech execs back on track. It was all about its use in Silicon Valley, endorsed by no less than Elon Musk. So what's the downside of ketamine?
Other than you might become Elon Musk. Ketamine is not a psychedelic, in spite of what the word gets wobbled around. It's called a dissociative, and in higher doses, it works really well for helping certain kinds of depression. Doesn't work all that long, so you need to take it periodically, but it is probably much better than antidepressants. It's not a psychedelic, and if you take it at a microdose, basically there's not much effect that you would even notice or care about.
And the other problem with ketamine is it's really subject to abuse. We have a story in the book about somebody who bought a 2-year supply and used it in a weekend. And, people get into the K-hole that they call it. And so it's just, you'll hear the word microdosing used for everything, for coffee, for marriage, for cannabis, or which we're saying you can't really do it. And so we're trying to draw some lines and make some definitions that we're hoping the whole psychedelic community can live with. So there are some substances that we might find that we're wrong about. Another one is DMT, which is all the rage. But from my experience, you can't really microdose DMT. If you are aware of what it is and you have any of it enter your system, it's a powerful psychedelic. It's not going to be, Jim used to use the word subperceptual, which stuck. Now we're saying it's sub-threshold. You're below the level where you're having any psychedelic visualizations or any of the stuff that we all know about. And in fact, one of the reframes that we try to do in the book is that the kind of psychedelic doses that people have always taken, the high doses that Jim was only interested in for 45 years, that may amount to a kind of overdose. And there's such a broad swath of benefits at this much lower level that they're really entirely different substances, and we need to think of them very differently.
I want to get into the benefits, obviously, but I was laughing as I read the book because there's long COVID and there's depression and there's porn addiction and there's asthma and if you guys didn't have the reputation that you have earned, you'd sound like carnival hucksters.
Yes.
Step right up, we'll fix everything.
Yes.
But it doesn't cure everything, and it's not for everyone. So who is it not for?
Well, wonderfully, it's for people for whom it doesn't work. There are certain foods which your friends love and you don't. Are you wrong? No. Are they wrong? Yes. We're different. And what we know with microdosing is if it isn't working, then you stop. If it's working in a way that makes you uncomfortable, you stop. And because these are very low doses and the effects are relatively mild, it's not a big deal. So the question of who it's not for, there are many conditions. Why are there so many conditions? Okay, let's look at that. It does sound to me, not only to you, but to me as hucksterism. And we have a wonderful Professor Nutt, N-U-T-T, who was the drug czar of England for a while. He said, anything where they say it's good for a whole lot of things, I'm very skeptical. And we said, yes, we're going to make that like the heading of a chapter, because there's another way of looking at it. That's why I mentioned the word vitamin. See, nobody says a vitamin is a symptom suppressant. A vitamin is something that affects the whole body. And it's okay. Vitamin D isn't for a disease. It's for the body. So we're seeing microdosing as something that allows the body to function more effectively, which should mean that a great many different conditions should be helped by a healthier body. Now, let me give you the category that we're putting microdosing in. Can you think of something which it is good for everything? Exercise, right? How about sleep? Yeah. How about eating better? How about microdosing? So that's what we're looking at, is it fits better into those general categories, because those are whole body kind of improvements.
And we do have some scientific intuitions about why this is so. And one of these is about microdosing producing more neuroplasticity, meaning your brain is more able to change and quote unquote rewire itself. Another one is that these very small doses still have powerful anti-inflammatory effects. And as we're seeing more articles about inflammation being linked to a whole bunch of neuropsychiatric disease. And another one, which is a little bit vaguer, but really true, is that microdosing seems to bring people back to equilibrium or homeostasis. Or the comments we often get from people is that, you know, I'm back. I feel like me again. So without knowing exactly how all of the neurochemistry works on all of that, if those three are generally true, you could see why it's helping so many things.
Mm-hmm. People shift from being in pain to having pain. And you talk about a number of people, you're not touting this as a cure.
No.
It doesn't cure a muscular disease, for example. But what's the difference between being in pain to having pain?
All the difference in the world when you're in it. Being in pain is it's kind of taken over a lot, almost your personality. I'm a pain person. I'm in pain all the time. I have such and such, and I'm in pain. Versus, part of me is in pain. Part of me is damaged. Part of me is broken and repairing. That's a very different feeling. And what we find out with pain is there are basically fall into two groups. People say on a pain scale, 1 to 10, good hard science, nobody knows what any of the numbers mean. I'm now a 4 and I was a 7. That's terrific. Other people say, I'm still a 7, but it doesn't bother me as much because it's not me. So we have either this mental shift and this physical pain shift. And that's one of the areas we're looking at, because it turns out there are two kinds of pain. One is the system is hurt. You know, you run a nail through your hand, you'll notice, okay? Because the nerves around the hole are very upset. What happens when you have an injury and your body is totally cured of the injury and the pain remains? There's only one possible source for that pain, your brain. And it's called brain amplification, pain amplification by the brain. It may be that microdosing is more likely to improve those kinds of conditions.
The section on depression points out there are benefits to SSRIs. A lot of people do benefit from them, but there are questions about whether we're looking at a placebo effect. There are questions about who they're good for. And one of the things you point out in particular is that SSRIs for depression can have a flattening effect. You're not as depressed, but you're never quite as happy either.
Right.
So talk about that and how the use of microdosing can tackle that.
Well, SSRIs make the things that are terrible in your life more bearable. So you don't feel as bad about what you feel bad about. And for a lot of us, that's terrific. However, the common problem is, how many of you have used an antidepressant? Okay. If I say, do you know that zombie effect? You know what I'm talking about? Which is the feeling of flatness, which is, no, I don't feel bad. I don't feel good either. I don't feel much. Okay, and that's one of its main effects. And what we found is with microdosing, and we're measuring now on the same scales of depression, that people report the same bad things don't feel as bad. However, good things feel better. So you're less sad, but you're more glad. And that's when people say, I'm back. I feel the way I did before I was depressed. Wow. And one of the main uses, curiously, of microdosing is helping people come off of not only SSRIs, but energizers, Adderall, ADHD meds. Why can it take you off of stimulants and depressants? Well, Professor Nutt says, maybe I'm skeptical. We say we're skeptical too, but that's what everyone tells us. And the people who come off Adderall say, I get a lot of the same improvements that I was using Adderall for without the terrible side effects, the crash, the addiction, and as I'm now kind of getting close to it, getting the expense. I'm appalled at what they charge for very small amounts of very inexpensive chemicals. And US government, you may start people on Adderall, on ADHD meds, at age 3. And don't worry, it's only for their lifetime.
And there's about 80,000 kids, we think, in the United States right now who are 3 and on Adderall.
And you don't recommend microdosing for children, but there is a case in the book that's really interesting, and that's he's really still a boy, 9th grade.
Yeah, yeah.
And he went, was it, recall long COVID? Was that his story?
Is this the autism case?
Yes.
It's autism.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's younger.
And he had all kinds of problems, and this gradually worked for him.
Yeah, his father wrote to Jim, and Jim said, well, I obviously can't recommend this for you and your kid, and he went ahead and did it anyway. And the first thing he reported that his child was no longer hitting his head against the floor. And now, a few years later, he says he gives the boy a dose about once a month, and that completely resets him, and he's much better off. And his
He's
language
much happier. He's more sociable. He basically is more the kind of person that you want your child to be like. The reason that we say we obviously can't recommend it is because, it's curious. You can't recommend medications to children because their brains are still developing. Tell that to the millions of kids who are taking ADHD meds. And what our point of view is, and this is just an idea, that it's probably less dangerous to give your children something with incredibly few side effects called microdoses than medications where we know the side effects and we know the addiction and we know the individual lifetime problems.
There's some interesting side streets you went down. For example, neurodivergent people might be in a whole different category when it comes to how the dosing goes and what works for them. Talk about that a bit.
Well, when Sophia Korb, a colleague of mine some years ago, we just put out a little notice that said, if you write us, we'll tell you what we think will be a good dosage level for psychedelics. In return, we'd like you to fill out a little mood form, takes you about a minute a day, and at the end of a month, just tell us what's happening. And we got a whole group of people that said, well, your doses were worthless. I got nothing out of them. But when I took, instead of, say, 10 micrograms of LSD, I took 50, I had all of the suggested changes that you thought were possible. And so I said to Sophia, how should we do this? She said, let's put them out of the study. I thought, that's why she's called science. But obviously, that was the most fascinating. And we find it a beautiful autistic, high-functioning autistic person got involved, wrote a beautiful book called Autism on Acid about what it's like growing up with high-functioning autism. And again, Eldon is not a bad model, which is brilliant and very poor social skills because they don't see social cues. So those of you that are nodding, they don't know quite what that means, okay? So what happens with microdosing is gradually you begin to see the social cues. You know those movies where everybody's in black and white and then something cool happens and this person's in color and this person's in color? That's the feeling, like, oh, that's what everybody is doing at a social occasion. And my favorite story is the guy who goes to the party and he microdoses, and he's ready to have the usual terrible time he always has. But he doesn't. He talks to people, and they talk back to him, and we converse, and it's so exciting. But people are going home. It's midnight. It's 1 o'clock. But I'm still able to communicate and be with people. So he drives around the city and he finds an all-night bar, just so he can use this new developed, the veil came off his eyes. So a lot of things we don't understand about microdosing, and that's quite a few of them in just one case.
And you're right, there are some situations where the normal beginner's dosing recommendations that we go with don't seem to apply, or the frequency. So in the shingles section, it looks like people who are working with shingles, which surprised us that it had an effect on it, they're taking a dose multiple times a day because that's what works for them. And so it keeps evolving. Or you look at the cluster headaches. There's a great organization called Cluster Busters. And when they started out, and these cluster headaches, they say, are maybe the most painful pain that human beings can experience. So when they started, everyone on the board and the founders were taking like 5 or 7 grams of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, which is a lot. It's a lot. And now they're saying they recommend people start at 0.25 grams, which is in the microdosing range, and then work their way up. And it turns out most of them are a little bit above 1 gram is where it works best. So we keep learning all of these new little things.
We didn't get to yet is how they're getting this advice, what kind of guidance they're getting. What do you do if you want to start microdosing? Do you take someone with you? Do you go to a professional? What do you do?
There's a book.
There's
a book that I recommend very highly.
Jim's new analogy is that learning to microdose is a little bit like learning to ride a bike or learning to drive a car. You might be able to learn to do those things by yourself, but if you're riding a bike and you have somebody holding you and then you don't know they're holding you, and then all of a sudden you're riding, it's a lot easier if you're following the guidelines. So we know that the guidelines that we have for people aren't going to work for everybody. And you're right, people are very individual and biodivergent, and there's some people it's not going to be for, and some people need much lower, and some people need higher doses. But overall, in most cases, all things being equal, what we recommend works pretty well. And that's a large part of why we wrote the book.
And there's now a new occupation arising called microdose coaches. And I've worked with groups being trained in South America, groups being trained in Europe, and groups being trained here. Because for a lot of conditions, if people want support, they want help, they want to be reminded, particularly, for instance, if you're using it to come off addictions. It's really helpful to have someone who has been there and has been through what you're going through and can support you. So there, again, many people use it on their own, and more people are finding for particularly harder situations that obviously community groups, individual coaching, etc., are helpful.
Yeah, we were being interviewed for a podcast the other day, and the woman just kept wanting to know about a provider and people who could help. So in her model, you really need a coach. And for people who want a coach and they'll give you intentions and they'll do integration later and they're there in case something happens, you should absolutely use a coach or a therapist or have a friend who is microdosing informed. But other people really can do this by themselves, and they actually don't like having their hand held that closely, and so they don't need someone like that.
Also, let's talk just a few numbers. Reddit has a subreddit called microdosing. Currently, 290,000 people are on it, okay? Last year, Google search had this, if you look at kind of how many people are asking the word microdosing, it goes that year, and then, whoo, what happened? 3 million people last year were checking what microdosing was. So there's not enough coaches to go around, don't worry. But there are a lot of people who are seeing that the possibility of a safer pharmaceutical or something that just makes your life work a little better and your life's working fine, like exercise, etc., looks to us like a good way to go.
And even the idea of doing it at home, in Canada now there's a fairly advanced official study going on that the government's behind that's using LSD for depression, and that's an at-home study. I mean, they're sending people stuff and telling them what to do, but so you can see how this is so much vastly less expensive than high-dose work.
I want to, this is a complete tangent, but as a writer, Jordan, some of the people who've had relief from various conditions came up with the most beautiful phrases. There's the woman who finally, after a lifetime of anorexia, she finally was released from that. She said, "Here I am in my full-hipped, loudmouth glory." And someone else said, "I didn't feel like a senior in my body. I felt like I did as a kid. Even my mind felt the joy, wondering what a new day would bring." It just, as a writer, you must have loved that.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. Actually, our editors wanted to get rid of that first quote that you just gave. They thought it was like a little too out there. And we said, no, that's what the person said. So we tried to, we use a lot of participatory citizen science anecdotes, real world evidence. And so the great value of this book, in addition to bringing together all the existing science, is we have hundreds of stories that Jim has gathered and other people have gathered. And when you read the actual stories, like when you read the 10 pages on mothers who took mushrooms, which there's no other research in the world on, and our friend let us work with her and point that out, even though some of them had a few problems with legal being afraid or digestive stuff or sleep stuff, the overwhelming feeling you get from these women who were breastfeeding or pregnant or parenting with young children was that this was really good for them and made things completely different than, for example, the last time when they had a child and didn't do microdosing. The latching mechanics were better. There was much less postpartum depression. They felt much more in tune with their child. When you read stories like this, you really get the powerful impact of how it's affecting people's lives.
Yeah, we're kind of overwhelmed by what we call real world evidence. One of the things, I have lots of friends who do psychedelic science, but one of the things they do when they're doing a study, you're doing a study on something, obesity, smoking, depression, who do you pick to be in the study? The people most likely where it's going to help them, and the people who aren't going to give you any trouble, such as people who might have some other conditions, so you eliminate those. I remember a researcher in Canada saying, I love my research, but when I go to my clinic, that's not the people I see. Real world evidence is the final evidence for any medical, therapeutic, etc. breakthrough. And so we, in a sense, we're very fortunate. We start with real world evidence and work up to getting people interested in doing the science.
People talk about how anecdotal evidence is weak.
Yeah, I don't know why they do that.
Well, it's interesting that you looked at the value of a double-blind, placebo-based study, and you felt that maybe wasn't the way to go about it anyway.
We quote Jeff Bezos to begin one chapter, and he says, if your anecdotes and your data disagree, your anecdotes are usually correct. And it's not so much that you've mismeasured the data, it's that you're measuring the wrong thing. So that's why we also go into, in the West, starting with the Royal Academy in England in 1660, there's a long history of people taking substances, like nitrous oxide, for example, and having lots of people take it and comparing it and subjectively getting clear about what we know and what we don't know. The problem with double-blind, placebo-controlled for psychedelics is that people almost always know if they're on the psychedelic or not. So it's kind of an unwinnable scenario. And even if you're only on a microdose, you're usually kind of aware. And so the idea of the double-blind, placebo-controlled became legislated in as the gold standard after the thalidomide disaster. And there's a lot of people that unless you can do that, it's just not real science. It doesn't matter what you bring to the table.
Yeah, there's an old saying that says, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. But every problem isn't a nail. The problem is you only have a hammer. So, and the other thing is we had a negative review of the book that says there's not enough science in this book. And I thought, there's all the science there is. What can you do? Who are you attacking? Half of the microdose studies in the world were done in the last year and a half while we were working on the book. So we started the book dealing with people saying, well, this is very interesting stuff, but there's not any science. Now people say, well, this is very interesting stuff, there isn't enough science. They say, wait a moment. What's enough science? Well, we don't know. Is there enough science on antidepressants since they don't work for a minimum of 30% of the people? Well, we don't do that kind of research. because we're a company that's making antidepressants. We're not interested. By the way, there are no long-term studies on antidepressants done by pharmaceutical companies.
And it's just not true that there's no science. Microdose.me, for example, did a iPhone-based or smartphone-based study that had 8,000 people and another control group of several thousand people, and they found very strong results for microdosing.
Probably anecdotes. Anecdotes is like people talking. That's what the word means. Okay? And when you go to a therapist, they don't say, oh, we're going to test your blood to see what your mental illness is. No, they're going to ask you, and you're going to tell them, and they work from that position. But you don't say that therapists only work with anecdotes. They work with people speaking. So basically it's a derogatory term, okay? And even though in the United States we're coming back to using derogatory terms, not here.
I can imagine one of the criticisms being that Reddit is an anonymous site. The old saying is, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog.
Right.
So anybody can say anything there. So how do you, as professionals, look at that and say, this is valid for my study, this is not valid for my study?
Oh, we don't. We simply report what people have said, and we try and get a range of what they're saying. And if the people are from, say, different countries, we have reports from 81 countries. Okay, so it's out there. We have reports on many conditions, and we report. We don't kind of synthesize. We don't categorize. We don't turn it into a statistic. We say, here is this person. Let me give you one of our single-person cases: multiple sclerosis. Okay. Multiple sclerosis is a condition which you only get worse. Okay, slower, faster, but you only get worse. After 3 years of microdosing, she's walking more steps. Okay? And I've been in touch with her during those 3 years. She's had different improvements each year. She started by stopping the headaches she had for 20 years. She had multiple sclerosis for 20 years before she started microdosing. So she knows the territory. First thing was to stop having headaches, which she'd had since she was a child. That already is pretty sensational. The second year, something different happened. The third year, she said, I'm walking more steps. She said, I know because I have an iPhone. Okay? That's not an anecdote. That's data.
And the other thing is, what would be in it for all these people to make it up that they're getting better? Why would they take the time and the effort to post and to let Jim know, or to post in Reddit or post elsewhere? It just doesn't make sense.
You see that? I actually want to acknowledge the history that you go into a little bit. It's not a history book, but you do acknowledge, for example, that one reason we are where we are with research is because of Richard Nixon.
Right.
So for those who don't know, I know some of you already know that, but can you tackle that for us? How in the world is he connected to why we have so much trouble getting money for research and treating this as legit?
The year that Richard Nixon created a legislation which said psychedelics are without medical value and with a high possibility of addiction. How did he know there was no medical value? Well, he didn't look at the research because it was the most researched psychiatric drug on the planet that year. What Haldeman said later about that, he said, because the legislation allowed Nixon to attack groups such as the people who didn't like Vietnam, such as hippies, such as blacks, such as Jews. Those were his people that he hated. Psychedelics and cannabis were an entree to be able to harm them. Okay? Haldeman asked later, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So that legislation basically stopped research, and then the United States said to its many allies around the world, if you like us and we give you money and weapons, why don't you also make these drugs illegal? And a lot of countries said, okay. So formal research stopped. How many people took psychedelics after it was illegal? In the United States alone, and we'll only talk about LSD, and I guess I'm talking about most of you, yes. Okay? 40 million people took LSD. I don't know how many are taking psilocybin. During the years it was illegal. And if you do it by education, that was, most of those 40 million were in the top 50% of educated. So Nixon managed only to stop legal research. Also, we now know, remember Prohibition? None of you remember it, but you all studied it. Did Prohibition limit alcohol, or did it actually vastly increase the number of places where you could buy alcohol? When you make something that people want illegal, you are basically saying, I am the friend of criminals, go for it. So that's where we were, and now we're at the place where different states and different cities say, you know, if it only makes people feel better and it only helps mental health and it's not too expensive and it doesn't lead to any crime, maybe we can, quote, decriminalize it, which is put $0 in the police budget for doing anything about it. And that's where we are now.
I can't tell if you want to get in on that, Jordan.
No, I'm good. That was good.
I want to point people to the back of the book. There's a long list of medications where you already have the data that says that you're okay with these medications and microdosing together. There are 2 medications that are kind of crossed out. I had to wonder what those stories were. But does it indicate we might need a more traditional scientific approach, at least to look at those? Because I'm wondering, did they get crossed out because somebody got hurt, or what happened there?
Yeah, well, we crossed out a couple because we got reports that people were upset or hurt or sick. What we learned, however, is most of the time when people write in, I remember the guy very well, he wrote in and said, you know, I'm microdosing, how bad people you are. And then he listed like 6 symptoms, and I thought, woo, I agree, it's terrible. So I said to him, why don't you stop? He said, I hadn't thought of that. And then we have other people where we now say, have a symptom problem, try half the dose. Most of the time, the symptoms go away because they're a dose problem, not a medication, not a microdose problem. And we have, as I told you, people who want like 1/100th of the basic dose. So we're trying to discover how we can best inform people to make their own decisions.
Mm-hmm. Apparently, somebody came up with concerns about heart damage because you mentioned that in the book, but it sounds like it's not a thing.
Heart damage. There is no evidence that a microdose has ever caused any heart damage to any human being or laboratory animal. Now, I assure you that will do nothing to that rumor. There are drugs which will. Some of them were taken off the market. Excedrin. There was a weight loss drug, and if you took it in a dose approximately 1,000 times more than a microdose every day for months, you had a heart valve problem. It's kind of like saying, here is a ½ ounce of beer. Do you realize that people who drink 2/5 of alcohol, of vodka a day, get really sick? You better lay off of the beer. It's simply a different world.
Mm-hmm.
The heart valve is, I even know who first invented the idea. And it's someone who said to a newspaper person once, I don't like microdoses. He's one of the fine and scientists and a lovely human being. I don't know why he doesn't like microdoses, but he invented that. And it's done very well.
So basically, it's a theoretical pharmaceutical model that says that there might at some point be a real problem. And even in the latest study that came out on this, they start out in the abstract by saying it's a theoretical problem. And then they said, and when we first ran our data, looking at a lot of people who've done psychedelics and the heart problems, we found that there wasn't any problem. But then we found a way to rerun the data so that it looks like there still might be a problem.
By the way, the first run was, this is like 150,000 people, one of those lovely US health reports that you got a lot of data to work with. People who'd had psychedelics had less heart problems overall than people who hadn't. And they said, that's not going to work for us. We need to reanalyze the data. Science. Science is good for a lot of things. I had a graduate student once who did a very nice dissertation, small sample, and basic statistics didn't show much. But I read the reports, and obviously it helped people. It was about grief. She said, I'm going to hire a statistician from Stanford. Got a graduate student who helps people with their dissertations, and he ran a few things. He said, having no results. He said, but don't worry. I will find a statistic that will give you the results you need for your dissertation. And he did.
Science.
Science.
Now, there is somewhere where you do mention exercise and some caution, and that's in the area of people who are suffering with schizophrenia. And that does open a whole host of discussions, including the fact that some of them may not be competent to make that decision. So can you talk about that area?
This is another one of those cases, one of those situations where we have no actual cases of anyone taking a microdose and going into a full-blown schizophrenic, I don't know what the right word is, episode, or same with bipolar. But, we do legally say that anybody who has any family history with any of this stuff should talk with their doctors. But we haven't really seen that happening.
Well, the other thing is there's one little tiny article. The person who wrote it was the director of MAPS in Canada. It's about a few schizophrenics. And the one that I like best is he says, when I take high doses, it really fucks me up. But microdoses are really very helpful for me. So I don't really have, and I am, I'm a registered schizophrenic. So we, again, don't know. But we do know that high doses seem to be, well, they're much more risky in general. Okay, and every study you read, and I read a lot of these incredibly boring studies, says, and here are the people that shouldn't do it. And so I wrote to some of my friends who wrote the articles and said, do you have any evidence of that? Do you have people that have taken psychedelics and had all those bad things? And they send me their articles, which I just read. No evidence. Well, why isn't there any evidence in the research? Because nobody ever takes them into the research to find out. So at the risk of grandiosity, I went to Facebook. And I went to the bipolar group, who were also not allowed to take any of these studies. And the bipolar group, I said, can I ask your people about psychedelics? He said, sure. So I did. And I got all these lovely reports. Generally agreed, just so you know, if you have bipolar friends, generally agreed in the bipolar world, what we call real world evidence, don't take psychedelics when you're manic. You're high enough. However, in your depressed phase, psychedelics can be quite beneficial. So that's one step above anecdotal evidence because it's more than one person.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole bunch of people who talk to each other quite regularly. So a lot of it, remember, we don't know a lot. In the book, we try and limit ourselves to the places where people are clearest in their evidence, and some of the individual cases are just too gorgeous to leave out. And our goal in the gorgeous ones is to attract researchers.
I want to talk a little bit more about research, then we're going to send everybody home with a how-to. About the research, there are a couple discouraging things going on. There were promising results from a Canadian lab that you mentioned. And you were talking about, a British lab got approval, but didn't have the money. And they talked about, well, you need to have repeated experiments. You need to have beds for these people. And so, it was a lovely gift. They couldn't use it. And we're watching the CDC and the NIH get gutted. So all kind of research funding is going to be lost there. Are people looking ahead to see what alternative sources of research funding there might be?
Selling drugs, maybe? It's honestly kind of not our beat. I am aware that a number of people who would love to do certain kinds of research basically said, we can't raise the money for it. Now, microdosing is way less expensive than any other form of psychedelic research, and we're now getting more and more situations where people aren't foolish, saying, well, if you're giving 500 mics of LSD, you have to keep people in a bed, in a room, with somebody watching them, and that's very expensive. Microdosing, you say, here's your month of microdosing, please go home and tell us how it is. That's where we're going, and that's a very inexpensive form of research. In fact, all of you have done it. You've gone to a physician, you said, I have a condition. They say, I'm going to give you a prescription. You're going to have to stand in line longer than is fair to get your prescription, and you're going to take it as required on the little bottle twice a day, once every other day, and you're going to tell me about it. So that's how research can be done without, but then you lose all the beautiful bells and whistles that make you write these unreadable research documents.
But that might also be, I mean, what they call legit research might also be the trail to finally getting some governmental acceptance.
Right.
Right, like in this Canadian study on at-home LSD.
Yeah, they said there was a Canadian lab that you quoted saying it has the potential to be globally scalable, effective, and affordable way to treat patients. I mean, that must have made your hearts just leap.
Well, and it's also why some of the people who have based their whole careers around high doses, or who have companies and it's all around high, they don't like us so much, because this is the idea that we could actually address a lot of the depression that's out there in this simple, safe way where you can administer it at home, and there's almost, very, very little risk and very high possible rewards. That's potentially very disruptive of the existing paradigm, so people don't like it.
ADHD, and I think I'm right, $11 billion a year of ADHD meds in the United States. Well, why don't you take microdosing, which is a mushroom you can grow in a drawer? Well, that's a threat to a very profitable business, because the ideal business, as drug dealers know, is addiction.
Mhm.
So if you've got something that people take every day, and it's beneficial, and ADHD meds have many benefits, why would you want to encourage research which basically ends your business? And I asked at one point, why haven't pharma companies basically gotten on the LSD and psilocybin excitement? And they said, we're waiting for a company, a small company, to make it profitable. Then we'll buy them. I thought, okay, that's the way the pharmaceutical business works, and we're not in it. Microdosing has no economic benefits beyond being inexpensive.
And sort of an analog to this is we found that synthesized psilocybin, you can make it in a lab. Albert Hoffman synthesized LSD and psilocybin, but it's not as effective as making an extract of full psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Something about all of the other chemicals, the entourage chemicals that are with it, make it more effective. So that's another, they're not going to likely to come up with a new kind of psilocybin that's much better.
Right. Okay, let's do as much in the way of logistics as we can. You can't give out phone numbers and connections, I know that.
Right.
But if you want to tell people how to go about seeking a source, a counselor, all the things that we've mentioned, what do they do?
Well, what we really do, or what we would say on a public forum?
No, what you really do.
Actually,
Y'all aren't going to tell, right?
they're both the same. We say to people, and I've been astounded at how successful it is. You say, if there's a psychedelic group in your town, neighborhood, county, go to a meeting and just say what you're interested in. And I have had people who've said, I don't know anyone who's ever taken a psychedelic. I run a small shop in a small town in a super red state, and I repair vacuums. And I say, go find it. Start with someone who smokes marijuana. And within about 3 days, I get this note that says, thanks, man.
And the other thing is to ask people who are in your life who are younger, whether they're in school or they go to parties, they're going to know. And then you also have the option, as we said, it's become vastly easier to grow psilocybin at home than it was in, let's say, the 1970s. So it's much simpler. And as you read through the book, you'll see there's a couple of other substances that we talk about that are actually legal. You could just order it and they will work.
Now, the other problem is there are illegal substances you can also order, but it's very hard to know what you're getting. So the problem of purity and so forth, and we mentioned the notion of there are tests for purity, there are scales for weighing, there are ways in which you do have to deal with the fact that the government has made it harder to do it safely.
And you don't want to ever buy something in a gas station, gummies, or because there was a case with this product called Diamond Shrooms where over 100 people went to the hospital and 2 died, and they were putting, it wasn't microdosing at all. They had all sorts of stuff in there. And so, gas stations are a really dicey place to get a hold of your psychedelics.
I want to end tonight with a note of hope. We need a lot of hope these days. So we're in some very hard times with some selfish, destructive people.
Right.
That's happening.
Okay.
And they're disemboweling the government. They're messing with the Constitution. And Jim, you noted that with people who have become lighter of heart and have become more themselves, nicer people increase hope and possibility. So I'd like you two to put those two thoughts together for me and ask if one has the potential to reverse or at least negate a bit of the other.
Yeah. Well, Paul Stamets, most of you know who that is the kind of most popular mycologist in the world. He says people who take psilocybin mushrooms are nicer. Let me add now someone else, the Dalai Lama, who Tibetans know a lot of stuff, but he doesn't talk about it. What he says is, if you can do nothing else, alleviate suffering. So that's what we're looking at. Here is substances which apparently alleviate suffering as a major effect, and their other major effect is that people feel nicer. They are nicer to themselves. They are nicer to the people they like. They are nicer to the people they don't like. Not as nice to the ones they like. But that's what they report. And so what we're hoping is that the feeling of being, and we're taking care of each other, which we're all being asked now more to do. So that's what we're looking at. And basically, we've put out a book of information. We go out of our way to say, we're not saying you should use these substances. Of course we are. But we don't say that. And right in the book at the front, that disclaimer you always read, which is, don't believe anything you read in this book. And the publisher didn't do it. And in fact, nobody did it. And you should go to a doctor who knows nothing about these things to get their advice. Okay, so it's all there, don't worry. But we're also reporting on the millions of people who are currently microdosing and what they can tell us that might be of use to ourselves, to our friends, to our children. I have a new area that I want to open up, which we have almost no evidence, is microdosing for pets. How's that for hope?
Start with cats.
Cats are tricky.
Jordan, any last thoughts from you?
Well, just that we hardly talked about the whole other part of the benefits range, which is enhanced performance. So that's anything from art and writing and painting to any type of physical endeavor, sports, martial arts, skiing, volleyball. We have stories about a lot of those. And part of what I'm expecting is that people in pretty much every possible area of creative and physical endeavor is that you will see aficionados at the high end who are working with microdosing. We had a report the other day and during a podcast from Ben Greenfield that long distance runners are already, ultramarathoners are completely clued in already. So you're gonna see it, that's the amazing thing. It's both these physical and mental health conditions, but it's also better poetry, better sex, better martial arts. It seems to be better everything, as long as you stick with the conservative protocol and the low doses and the taking time off. So all that's very important if you want to get these kind of results.
I want to thank you both.
Well, we're so happy you were here and helped us. I just want people to notice what it means to prepare.
Thank you all. Can you thank our guests?
Thank you, Angie.
Are we setting the guys up for books, for signings?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful job. Thank you. Oh, the flower? The shake? Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.
Oh, do they get?